He stood 6'3", covered in tattoos that hinted at a troubled past. Marcus strutted toward the motionless royal guard with a defiant smirk. "This'll be easy," he muttered to himself. 5 seconds later, Marcus was on the ground, blood pooling around his head, 2 teeth knocked clean from his mouth. The guard hadn't even broken his stance. What happens when raw arrogance meets disciplined calm? I'm about to show you. Make sure to like and subscribe for more amazing content. The summer heat bore down on Buckingham Palace as tourists gathered for photos, unaware of the approaching storm in human form. Children licked at rapidly melting ice cream cones while parents adjusted camera settings, all oblivious to the disruption cutting through their carefully framed holiday moments. Marcus Stone moved through the crowd with practiced menace, his path clearing through raw intimidation. At 6'3", his frame dominated the space around him, each step claiming territory as the calm palace grounds braced against his incoming wave of aggression. His knuckles, scarred from countless confrontations, told a violent history, each mark a story he'd embellished over pints to whatever audience would listen. The pristine palace grounds stood in stark contrast to Marcus's crude presence. Where the palace represented centuries of tradition, he embodied immediate chaos. Guards maintained their posts while Marcus's tank top revealed arms covered in blue and black ink. Not artistic expression, but violent tallies, trophies of masculine power claimed in pub brawls across East London. "Move," he growled at a family trying to capture a photo, shoving past them without waiting for a response. The smell of cheap beer and cigarettes followed in his wake. A young mother pulled her children closer as he passed, recognizing the predatory way he scanned the crowd, seeking his next target among those distracted by guilt and pageantry. "Fancy prison, innit?" he muttered, gesturing toward the palace with contempt thick in his London accent. "And look at these toy soldiers standing guard. Probably pissed themselves in a real fight." The words carried just loud enough for nearby visitors to hear, creating a bubble of space around him that moved as he did. Marcus's heavy boots struck the ground with unnecessary force, each step a small violence against historic stones. Tourists who had been jostling for photos suddenly found urgent reasons to be elsewhere, a response Marcus had grown to crave. This power to clear a path through sheer presence. A glint of metal flashed from his back pocket as he turned. Brass knuckles, partially concealed but deliberately visible. The weapon suggested this wasn't his first confrontation, nor did he intend it to be his last. He'd brought them for a purpose, a prop in the performance of dominance he'd been rehearsing his entire adult life. His eyes narrowed as he spotted his target, a royal guard standing at attention. The guard's eyes stared forward, trained never to react, a challenge Marcus couldn't resist. Where others saw tradition and discipline, Marcus saw only weakness waiting to be exposed. "Found you," he whispered, a predatory smile spreading across his face. He began circling, the way he'd approach an opponent in the ring behind the Dog and Duck pub, where he'd established his reputation. Each step calculated to establish dominance before the first word was spoken. What Marcus couldn't understand was the fundamental difference between intimidating drunk adversaries and confronting a professional soldier. His identity was built on street dominance, on being the biggest threat in rooms full of civilians. He had no frame of reference for the disciplined violence contained within the motionless guard, no way to recognize the years of training hidden beneath ceremonial regalia. As Marcus locked eyes on his target, his predatory circling began. He failed to notice how security personnel had already spotted him, how certain tourists with military bearing were watching with knowing expressions. Marcus saw only what he wanted to see, a stationary target, a chance to prove his dominance, an opportunity for a story he'd tell later over drinks. While Marcus circled like a predator, what he saw as a statue in uniform concealed something far deadlier. A warrior whose stillness wasn't weakness, but the practiced calm before a storm. The guard's immobility represented a disciplined power that Marcus, with his street-learned aggression, fundamentally misunderstood. He saw only a man forbidden to move. He failed to recognize the coiled readiness beneath the ceremonial exterior. Two elderly men stood among the crowd of tourists, their weathered faces marked by lines earned in conflicts long past. Their eyes narrowed as they watched Marcus prowl around the guard. They exchanged knowing glances, a silent communication born from shared experience. They recognized the quiet power in the guard's stance, a strength coiled like a spring, calibrated to release precisely the necessary amount of force when required. "Look at the lad's eyes," one veteran whispered to the other, "fixed forward with parade ground precision." His companion nodded, noticing what tourists missed: the subtle tension in the guard's bearing, visible only to those who understood real combat experience. That 1,000-yard stare had been forged in the dust and chaos of battlefields, not on palace grounds. The morning sun illuminated the guard's uniform, casting golden reflections off polished brass buttons and campaign medals. Each medal told a story of service, of moments when composure under pressure meant survival. The ceremonial uniform concealed the frame of a man who had carried wounded comrades through enemy fire. While Marcus was still perfecting his intimidation tactics at local pubs, Marcus increased his taunting, his voice growing louder as the guard's continued silence wounded his pride. "What's wrong, toy soldier?" "Queen cut your tongue out?" he sneered, moving closer. Tourists backed away, creating an impromptu arena. The guard remained unmoved, his discipline holding firm, the result of training in combat stress management, where emotional control determines battlefield outcomes. From a discreet distance, palace security personnel monitored the situation through earpieces and sidelong glances. One moved his hand toward his radio but stopped. The guard's composure suggested he required no assistance. His stillness communicated clearly: situation noted, response prepared if necessary. Marcus grew increasingly agitated by the guard's non-reaction. His street logic told him silence meant weakness. He couldn't grasp that he was witnessing supreme confidence born of genuine combat experience. The guard stood as a professional conserving energy, assessing threats and preparing responses with tactical precision. "You know what makes that guard different?" the taller veteran murmured. "He's been somewhere that matters, somewhere that separates the real soldiers from the pretenders." His friend nodded solemnly. Both men recognized the difference between theatrical intimidation and battle-tested resolve. The crowd's nervous energy built as Marcus continued his one-sided confrontation. Children were quietly ushered away by parents sensing the potential for trouble. The guard maintained his stance with the control that only comes from professional military conditioning, where standing watch might precede direct action within seconds. As minutes passed without achieving his desired reaction, Marcus's frustration visibly mounted. His shoulders tensed, hands clenching at his sides. What started as a performance had become a personal challenge, a challenge he was losing with each second of the guard's indifference. Marcus's patience finally ran out. His body language shifted subtly but unmistakably into a boxer's stance. Weight balanced on the balls of his feet, shoulders rotating forward, right hand drawing back. He was telegraphing his intentions to everyone except himself, unaware that his posturing revealed more about his lack of training than it projected threat. That moment when a fist connects with flesh changes everything, not just legally, but in the internal calculus of a trained professional soldier. While the guard had tolerated Marcus's verbal barrage with statuesque indifference, physical contact would trigger a transformation that the watching veterans could already anticipate with grim certainty. "Time's up," Marcus announced, his voice cutting through the murmur of the crowd. The audience had grown larger, tourists forming a loose semicircle, smartphones raised to capture the unfolding drama. Marcus played to this unwanted attention, his performance becoming more theatrical with each passing second. The silence from the guard had become unbearable to Marcus. Each moment without reaction struck him as a personal affront, a challenge to his identity as the alpha male, the enforcer. His knuckles whitened as his fist clenched tighter. Marcus's arm launched forward, his fist hurtling toward the guard's jaw. The punch carried the technical refinement of a drunk at closing time, wide, telegraphed, and fueled by frustration rather than skill. For a fleeting moment, Marcus hesitated, a flash of uncertainty crossing his features before commitment sealed his fate. The impact resonated across the suddenly silent courtyard, a dull thud that made onlookers wince. A single droplet of blood formed at the corner of the guard's mouth, vibrant crimson against the controlled pallor of his features. For a fraction of a second, the guard's head tilted with the force of the blow. Marcus grinned, interpreting the blood as victory. "Not so tough now, are you?" he crowed, oblivious to crossing the critical threshold between harassment and assault. In the UK legal system, that distinction transformed the guard from ceremonial figure to a professional with the right to defend himself. The elderly veterans exchanged knowing glances. They understood what Marcus couldn't, that the guard's restraint was about protocol and discipline, the measured application of force that distinguishes professionals from amateurs. The taller veteran gripped his companion's forearm, a wordless warning to maintain distance. With mechanical precision, the guard's head returned to its forward position. There was no rush, just the deliberate movement of someone operating according to training rather than emotion. Blood traced its way down to his chin, but he made no move to wipe it away. The crowd held its collective breath. A mother pulled her child closer, eyes wide with apprehension. An older man lowered his camera, his expression shifting from curiosity to concern like a cloud passing over the sun. Marcus stood with his arms spread wide. "See that? These fancy uniforms don't mean shit." His voice carried across the courtyard, but the expected chorus of approval never materialized. Instead, uncomfortable silence settled over the gathering. Royal Guard protocol dictated maintaining position during verbal harassment, preserving the dignity of the uniform. But that same protocol contained a crucial clause. Physical assault permitted proportional defense, precise as a scalpel cutting through bravado. The transformation began with the eyes. Throughout the confrontation, they had remained fixed forward, seeing everything and acknowledging nothing. Now, those eyes shifted to lock directly onto Marcus's face. The change was subtle but profound, like watching a museum mannequin suddenly acknowledge your presence. In that moment, the ceremonial statue transformed into a combat veteran whose stillness wasn't weakness but practiced discipline. Marcus, reaching for his phone, froze mid-motion, suddenly uncertain. The veterans took an instinctive step backward, a movement rooted not in fear but in professional courtesy, giving space to a colleague about to conduct necessary business. They recognized in the guard's altered stance something Marcus couldn't perceive: the weight shift of a man who processed threats with tactical awareness born from actual combat experience. Combat veterans can read the subtle language of violence like scholars decipher ancient texts, each micro-movement telling a story invisible to untrained eyes. As the guard's weight shifted almost imperceptibly, the watching veterans recognized something that made them step back: the unmistakable preparation for a technique that targets the central nervous system itself. "You hit like a woman," the guard said, his voice low and measured. There was no anger in it, just the calm assessment of someone who had faced far worse. The words hung in the air for a moment, slicing through Marcus's bravado more effectively than any shouted threat could have. For the first time since his arrival, uncertainty flickered across Marcus's face. This wasn't the reaction he had expected, not the wounded pride or the cowering submission he was accustomed to provoking. Instead, he faced something entirely foreign to his world of bar fights and parking lot scuffles, a man who had carried wounded comrades through sniper fire in Helmand Province. The guard's eyes, now locked onto Marcus, conveyed a world of experience that made the biker's street credentials seem like a child's playground boasting. The veterans watching nearby saw the transformation, the subtle shift in his weight distribution, the almost invisible tensing of his core muscles, the grounding of his feet. Like a chess master preparing his decisive move, each micro-movement served a calculated purpose in a strategy Marcus couldn't begin to comprehend. What happened next seemed to unfold in slow motion for those with the experience to appreciate it. The guard's movement began from the ground up, a perfect kinetic chain transferring energy from his planted feet through his hips into his torso and finally expressing itself through his striking hand. Like a well-oiled machine, each component moved with precisely timed efficiency, creating a symphony of controlled force. His fist traveled a shorter distance than Marcus's had, yet carried exponentially more force, a textbook orbital strike targeting the mandibular nerve cluster with surgical precision. The sound of impact echoed across the courtyard, a sharp crack that made tourists flinch and instinctively step back. The veterans remained still, their expressions reflecting a singular truth. They were witnessing the unbridgeable gap between street brawling and combat proficiency. Marcus's head snapped back with such velocity that small droplets of blood and fragments of teeth created a brief, grotesque constellation in the air before gravity reclaimed them. His knees suddenly forgot their purpose. The neural overload from the precisely targeted strike had temporarily severed the connection between his brain's commands and his body's responses. "Protocol allows me to take the first punch," the guard explained, his voice still unnervingly calm, as Marcus crumpled before him. "It also permits appropriate response to direct physical assault." His uniform remained pristine despite the small stain of blood at his collar. The physics of the moment told its own story. The guard had remained almost perfectly stationary, conserving his energy and position, while Marcus's body absorbed and redirected all the force. It was conservation of energy demonstrated through human anatomy, a lesson Marcus would remember long after his physical wounds had healed. As teeth and blood scattered across the ancient stones, the nearby tourists gasped in shock. But the veterans nodded in silent understanding. In that single, precise strike, they recognized the culmination of years of disciplined training, not just technical mastery, but the moral restraint that separated professionals from thugs. The guard could have done far worse, but had chosen the minimum effective response. His training hadn't just taught him how to fight, it had taught him when and how much force to apply. The ancient stones had witnessed countless dramas over centuries, but even they seemed to pause as Marcus's reality crumbled faster than his shattered teeth. What happens when a man who's built his entire identity on intimidation suddenly finds himself reduced to unintelligible whimpers in front of the very audience he sought to impress? Marcus swayed on unsteady legs, the neural overload from the guard's precise strike having temporarily disconnected his brain's commands from his body's responses. Blood cascaded from his ruined mouth, pooling at his feet in stark contrast to the pristine palace grounds. Each attempt at speech produced nothing but wet, gurgling sounds, a cruel physiological betrayal for a man whose currency had always been intimidation through words and posturing. The precision strike to his mandibular nerve cluster disrupted his entire facial communication system. His compromised jaw prevented him from articulating even the simplest protest. With each failed effort to speak, fresh rivulets of crimson streamed down his chin and onto his tank top. The man who had arrived radiating menace now stood drooling helplessly, his body betraying his desperate attempts to salvage his dignity. Meanwhile, the guard had already resumed his ceremonial stance, returning to his post with military precision. Only a small crimson stain on his white collar strap betrayed the moment of violence, like a single drop of paint on a perfect canvas. His eyes had returned to their forward gaze, as though the palace itself had absorbed and forgotten the disruption, standing immutable while false power crumbled before it. Police officers approached with professional efficiency, quickly assessing the blood-spattered scene. One officer took control with clinical detachment, directing his colleagues to transport Marcus to St. Mary's for facial trauma treatment. In that moment, Marcus transformed from threat to medical case, his presence diminished to a problem requiring management rather than a danger demanding respect. As officers moved to escort him, the two elderly veterans stepped forward, weathered faces carrying quiet authority. "We saw everything," the taller veteran said. "The guard showed remarkable restraint, all things considered." Their testimony wasn't merely procedural, It represented a deliberate alignment with disciplined response, a recognition from men who understood controlled violence. To these veterans who spoke the language of justified force, the Guard's response exemplified proportional action, enough to neutralize without excess. Marcus tried to protest but produced only childlike whimpers, his facial muscles refusing to form words. Each attempted sound became another humiliation as officers guided him toward medical assistance. His confident swagger had dissolved into a stumbling gait. The predator transformed to wounded prey before the crowd's watching eyes. Smartphones captured his downfall, ensuring his digital defeat would outlast his physical injuries. The very devices that might have recorded his dominance now documented his complete unraveling, his perception of himself violently realigned with reality. For Marcus, the legal aftermath proved particularly bitter. Without the ability to provide a coherent statement, his facial trauma rendering him literally speechless, he found himself unable to file charges. The witness statements confirming he had initiated the confrontation, combined with the Guard's military background, created a narrative he couldn't challenge. The Guard's actions fell squarely within reasonable self-defense, leaving Marcus without legal recourse. As Marcus was led away, blood still dripping from his shattered mouth, he understood something profound. His intimidation had always been theatrical, a performance that collapsed when challenged by genuine capability. The ancient palace, which had witnessed the rise and fall of actual power throughout centuries, seemed to stand a little taller as another pretender was escorted from its grounds. The confrontation that unfolded that summer day carries lessons far beyond the immediate physical consequences. In the quiet aftermath, as the crowd dispersed and routine resumed, a profound truth remained etched in the ancient stones alongside those small drops of blood. True strength lies not in the ability to inflict violence, but in the discipline to control it. As the scene shifts from Marcus's defeat to the unwavering Guard, a stark contrast emerges. While Marcus's wounds will eventually heal, the bitter taste of humiliation will persist, a reminder that his misreading of restraint as weakness led to his downfall. The Guard continues his watch, unchanged. His calm demeanor revealed the psychological foundation of genuine respect. It flows naturally toward those who embody discipline, never to those who demand it through intimidation.